HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Golden Thread, How Fabric Changed History by Kassia St. Clair, read by Helen Johns.
Preface. If you take your eyes off this page and look down, you will see that your body is encased in cloth. I am assuming here, dear listener, that you are not naked. Perhaps you are sitting on the cushioned seat of a railway or metro carriage, or in the bosom of a plump sofa. You may be enrobed in a towel, confined within the colourful enclosure of a tent, or enfolded in bedsheets. All are made of cloth, whether woven, felted, or knitted. Fabrics, man-made and natural, have changed, defined, advanced, and shaped the world we live in. From prehistory to the early Middle Eastern and Egyptian civilizations, via the silken dragon robes of imperial China, to the Indian calicoes and chintzes that powered the Industrial Revolution, arriving finally at the lab-blended fibers that have allowed humans to travel further and faster than ever before. For much of recorded history, the four principal sources of natural fibers, cotton, silk, linen, and wool, have borne much of the strain of human ingenuity. They have been pressed into service to give warmth and protection, demarcate status, confer personal decoration and identity, and provide an outlet for creative talent and ingenuity. We live surrounded by cloth. We are swaddled in it at birth, and shrouds are drawn over our faces in death. We sleep enclosed by layer upon layer of it, like the pea that woke the princess in the fairy tale. And, when we wake, we clothe ourselves in yet more of it to face the world, and let it know who we shall be that day. When we speak, we use words, phrases, and metaphors in which the production of thread and cloth have insinuated themselves. The words line, lining, lingerie, and linoleum, for example, are all rooted in the word linen. For most people, who know little of the practical business of turning the stems of flax into thread, or conjuring damasks from a skeletal warp on a loom, these linguistic motifs could seem little more than empty shells washed up on a beach, a pallid reminder of something greater, richer, only half understood today, but worth our curiosity. When I studied 18th century dress at university, I was constantly confronted with the stubborn belief that clothing was frivolous and unworthy of notice, despite its evident importance to the society under discussion. When I went on to write about contemporary design and fashion, I encountered similar snobbery. Examination of fabrics is often ghettoized. Even when it is the principal focus of mainstream attention, it is usually the appearance and desirability of the end product being discussed, rather than the constituent raw materials and the people who fashion them. This book invites you to take a closer look at the fabrics that you surround and clothe yourself with each day. It is not, and was never intended to be, an exhaustive history of textiles. Instead, The Golden Thread contains 13 very different stories that help illustrate the vastness of their significance. In one chapter, you will be invited behind the scenes to watch the making of the spacesuits that allowed us to walk on the moon. Another looks at the craft that inspired Vermeer to paint The Lace Maker. Elsewhere, you'll meet the people who wrapped, and those who unwrapped, Egypt's mummies. Inventors and scientists who have spent their lives trying to make cloth from spider's silk, and those whose clothes failed them in the most extreme environments on Earth, with fatal consequences. It is a book written for the curious. I hope you enjoy it. I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate. William Blake, Jerusalem, 1815. Introduction. Threads and the Body. The threads the fates spin are so unchangeable that even if they decreed to someone a kingdom which at the moment belonged to another, and even if that other slew the man of destiny, to save himself from ever being deprived by him of his throne, nevertheless, the dead man would come to life again in order to fulfill the decree of the fates. Flavius Philostratus, Life of Apollonius Tiana, 3rd century AD. The ancient Greeks believed human destiny was controlled by the fates, 3 mythological sisters who visited every child soon after birth. Clotho, the most powerful, would take her spindle and spin the thread of their life. Lachesis carefully measured its length, and then Atropos would sever it, determining the exact moment of death. No human or god had the power to change their decisions once made. The Romans named their trio the Parcae, and the Norse had the Norns. This ancient story still echoes through the way we think about ourselves and our society. When we talk of lives hanging by a thread, being interwoven, or being part of the social fabric, or if we want to help someone in danger of unraveling, or being torn away from their friends or family, we are part of a tradition that stretches back many thousands of years. Fabric and its component parts have long been a figurative stand-in for the very stuff of human life. In many ways, this is only natural. The production of cloth and clothing has always been of great importance to the global economy and its cultures. Cloth gave humanity the ability to choose their own destiny. It's believed that prehistoric cloth-making in temperate regions consumed more working hours than the making of pottery and food production combined. In ancient Egypt, linen was revered. Not only did it form part of most people's everyday experience, it was, after all, the most common textile used for clothing, and many people would be involved in farming and making it. It also held profound religious significance. So much so, in fact, that the very act of mummification and the wrapping of the body with specially prepared cloths, as well as those that had been passed down through generations, transfigured ordinary human remains into something divine. Our cavalier attitude to cloth today would be anathema to our ancestors. Textiles have allowed humans the ability to live in and travel through a plethora of regions that might otherwise have proved too cold to be hospitable. Rich silks and warm woolen cloths, bartered through trade networks such as the Silk Roads, facilitated cross-cultural exchanges of ideas, craft techniques, and people. The dexterous finger-plied work of producing thread and cloth was the daily experience of countless individuals. It has been estimated, for example, that over 1 million women and children were employed in spinning in England alone by the mid-18th century. On the eve of the Industrial Revolution, the income they earned might represent 1/3 of a poorer household's income. This great economic shift, which in today's collective imagination is so closely bound up with steel and coal, was in fact largely powered by textiles, and of one kind in particular. "Whoever says Industrial Revolution," wrote Eric Hobsbawm in Industry and Empire, says cotton. This crop, and the textiles made from it, was arguably the first global commodity. While we no longer pay as much attention to the sourcing and quality of the individual pieces of cloth that we interact with on a daily basis, they remain deeply personal. We use clothing, for example, to signal to those we meet who we are and how we want to be perceived. Distinct uniforms exist for those working in city hedge funds, Silicon Valley startups, and media companies, for example, even though most of these people will actually spend the majority of their days in offices and behind desks. Subordinates often adopt the sartorial preferences of their bosses, and trends spread like wildfire within the confines of small institutions. There was an inexplicable vogue for sleeveless sweaters in one office where I once worked, and the same professors who earnestly explained how futile it was to find meaning in the clothing choices of 18th century ladies and gentlemen were usually clad in identikit tweed jackets and cord trousers, perhaps leavened with brightly coloured socks if they fancy themselves rebels. Social strata have long been codified, legally as well as unofficially, using cloth. Among the many strange prohibitions in the Old Testament, believers were enjoined not to sow thy field with mingled seed, neither shall a garment mingled of linen and woolen come upon thee. This wasn't a moral objection. Priests' garments were made of both, and this special combination was an honour reserved for them alone. Sumptuary laws that restrict the wearing of certain types of fabric to specific classes have existed for millennia. They can be found in cultures as diverse as those found in ancient China, classical Rome, and medieval Europe. A proclamation passed in England in 1579, for example, forbade ruffs made or wrought out of England, commonly called cutwork, to be worn by anyone under the degree of a baron's son, a knight, and gentleman in ordinary office, attending upon Her Majesty's person. Queen Elizabeth I, the reigning monarch, was consummately skilled in the arts of using luxurious display to express power, as her portraits so elegantly attest, although it seems likely that she loved beautiful fabrics for their own sake too. In a famous, although possibly apocryphal story, she was given a pair of knitted black silk stockings by her silkwoman Mrs. Montague in 1561, and refused to wear any other kind thereafter. Tools of the trade. I'm a weaver, a master weaver. I've got a loom where the best cloth's made. Plain cloth, twill, brocade or satin, I'm the master of my trade. Shed the warp and swing the shuttle, beat the reed, the weft is laid. I can wind a flying bobbin, I can walk a theme of thread. I can weave a sheet of linen, fit to grace a royal bed. Lift the heel and fly the shuttle, swing the reed, the weft is laid. English folk weaving song. All textiles begin with a twist. The word spinning now evokes an idea similar to twirling, like the action of a spinning top, but it originally denoted an action that was at once a twirl and a drawing out, akin to pulling candy floss out around a stick at a fair. Much the same action is used when spinning thin, delicate fibres by hand to make thread, which is altogether tougher and more useful. Fibres of wool or flax or cotton, which are shorter, finer and more slippery, and so trickier to work with, are drawn out from a large, loose mass of their fellows and simultaneously twisted into yarn. This takes practice. Jerky movements will result in lumpy, clotted thread, while drawing out too quickly or too slowly will mean the finished product is either too thin or too thick. The twist can be either clockwise, in which case it is a Z twist, or anti-clockwise, S twist. But getting it just right is vital. Under-twisted yarn will be too weak, but if it is over-twisted, it will buckle up on itself and be prone to wayward knots and tangles as you work with it. Able spinners are the products of hours of repetition and, usually, instruction from a good teacher, who introduces the learner to the intricacies of the craft. There are many ways to spin, and the methods a spinner uses depend on their culture, personality, the kind of product they wish to create, and the materials they are using. Some twist fibres between hand and the big toe or thigh, others use a spindle, a rod usually around a foot long, even a hooked stick will do. Spindles give spinners an advantage, since they also provide a place on which to wind the thread as it is made, preventing it from getting knotted. The same community might use several different methods. Threads, once made, might be used as they are, or plied with other threads to create stronger, thicker ones, better suited to hardier tasks. Thread, once made, can be put to all manner of uses, braided or corded to make laces or ropes, knitted or, of course, woven. Weaving is essentially the process of interlacing sets of threads together to form a continuous web. Classically, two sets of threads are woven together at right angles. The warp is held on a loom to prevent an unholy muddle, while the weft threads are patiently threaded through. There are countless ways of intersecting the threads when weaving. The simplest form is plain or tabby weave, where each weft thread goes over one warp thread and under the next. More complex methods, where the weft goes over or under several warp threads, for example, can produce cloth with diverse characteristics or patterns. Twill, for example, used to make denim, is created by passing the weft threads over one and under two or more. The finished fabric appears scored by diagonal lines and is hard-wearing. Given how finicky the processes involved are, and how soft, unruly, and fragile the raw materials, it's only natural that a whole dynasty of technologies has been developed to help in the production of cloth. Some, such as the spindle mentioned above, and the distaff, which was used to hold quantities of raw, unspun fibres, were allied to spinning. Others, such as the loom, were used for weaving. In essence, a loom is an implement used to hold the warp taut. One of the very earliest kinds, the backstrap, used the weight of a person's body to create tension. Another kind, common in ancient Greece, was known as the warp-weighted loom. It involved an upper horizontal bar from which the warp threads were suspended with weights at the bottom. No matter what the design, the weft is passed through from one side to the other, building up the fabric thread by thread. Later, more complicated loom designs allowed weavers to lift up some of the warp threads so the weft could be rapidly pushed through the gap, known as the shed, all in one go. The earliest use of this technology, known as the heddle loom, was in Egypt around 2000 BC. Much of the work that was needed to produce early thread and textiles is, of course, all but invisible today. The makers didn't often leave written records behind, and their techniques and skill have rotted away with the objects they created. What does survive leaves us with an asymmetrical impression. Someone using hand and thigh to spin will be invisible to the archaeological record, for example, while someone using a large stone spindle whorl will not. The same is true of looms. The more complex and permanent they are, the more traces they leave behind. Clothing is the most obvious use for textiles, but threads and fabrics reside in many places we do not expect them. My boots are laced with jaunty braided strands of red cotton, and as I type this, my wrists occasionally bump against a suede-like material called alcantara that covers my laptop keyboard and that is more usually found in high-end cars. If you own a Google Home, you may have noticed that portions of it are swathed in a comforting blend of polyester and nylon. Indeed, the designers of consumer electronics increasingly incorporate fabrics into their creations as a way of softening technology. Tech devices are now so much a part of our daily lives, it no longer makes sense to make them look hard-edged and futuristic. Instead, makers want them to blend into our surroundings, just another cuddly component of our domestic landscape, hence the use of fabric. But the idea of softening tech products using fabric is itself inherently odd. The industry of fabric is older than pottery or metallurgy, and perhaps even than agriculture and stock breeding. Cloth is the original technology. Trade and technology. The weavers take the intertwined threads and through their expert, value-added activity, create a strong fabric, which is exactly what the global distributed network of computers creating the Bitcoin blockchain does. David Orban, Weaving is a better metaphor for Bitcoin instead of mining, 2014. In 2015, Google I/O, one of the firm's secretive research and development divisions, announced that they were planning to make a pair of trousers that would also be computers. They would be made of a special textile, available in a wide palette of colours and myriad textures that would function as a touchscreen, registering special gestures and able to control devices such as smartphones. 2 years later, it turned out that while the trousers had proved unworkable, Google I/O partnered with Levi Strauss to produce a denim jacket instead. The fabric itself functioned exactly as it was supposed to. The jacket, which can be tapped or stroked to play or pause music, skip through tracks and so on, and which will also alert you if you get a text, went on sale for $350. Although early reviews have found the technology rather limited, you're only controlling the smartphone that's in your pocket after all, others see such smart fabric as the wearable tech of the future. The name chosen for this futuristic endeavour was Project Jacquard, a name with a 19th century pedigree. In 1801, Joseph Marie Jacquard invented a loom that made it possible to mass-produce textiles with complex woven patterns, something that previously had taken a great deal of skill, time, and expertise to produce. His Jacquard loom was controlled or programmed by pieces of card marked with a series of holes that determined the pattern. Much later, these ingenious hole-punched cards paved the way for another invention, computing. An American engineer repurposed the punched card system to help record census data. His firm eventually became part of International Business Machines, latterly known as IBM. The Jacquard loom is one of the more obvious links between technology and textiles, but examples can be found much further back. The earliest fabrics that we know were made by human hand were created using fibres gleaned from flax plants over 34,000 years ago. Transfiguring flax, wool, cotton, silk, hemp, or ramie into thread was a technological feat, requiring skill and tools, spindles and distaffs, many millions of which have been excavated from the world's oldest archaeological sites. These threads could then be used to create rope, nets, and, when woven together on looms, felted or knitted, textiles. Such technologies allowed our early ancestors to gather food more quickly, transport it over greater distances and more easily, and venture further afield to less temperate regions to seek out new habitats. At every stage of production, these materials were traded by their makers, forming a vital part of networks that crept over the globe like arteries, carrying language and ideas as well as goods. This trade meant that sophisticated methods of credit and bookkeeping were developed. Making cloth meant making money. Wealth created by the production and sale of textiles funded the Italian Renaissance. The Medici family, who were involved in the production of woolens, became the bankers of Europe during the 15th century. Their patronage helped Michelangelo make his David, Filippo Brunelleschi rebuild the Basilica di San Lorenzo, and Leonardo da Vinci paint the Mona Lisa. Further east, cotton textiles powered the Mughal Empire. Calicoes were exported to America, Africa, Europe, and Japan. China, meanwhile, jealously guarded the secrets of sericulture, silkworm rearing, for many centuries, monopolizing the lucrative silk trade. Even today, the results of specialization persist. Italy is the place to go for fine silks and Baroque prints. Mantero, a 100-year-old firm based near Lake Como, has an archive of over 12,000 books of swatches and samples from which to draw inspiration. The United Kingdom's mills remain the gold standard for woolens and worsteds. Chanel sources its tweeds from Linton tweeds, a relationship that dates back to the 1920s, when Coco Chanel met William Linton. For the latest in textile innovation, buyers will usually begin and end their search in Japan, which has a decades-long tradition of successful innovations with man-made fibers, such as Uniqlo's beloved Heat Tech range. The desire to produce cloth more efficiently provided the impetus for a jolting, uneven cascade of technological advancements. The earliest looms, requiring the weight of a human body, gave way to more complex horizontal or vertical models made of wood and weighted with large beads of clay or stone. Much later, as markets expanded and demand increased, the need for innovation became ever more urgent. In 1760, the Journal for the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce offered rewards for a machine for spinning 6 threads of wool, cotton, flax or silk at one time, and that will require but one person to work and attend it. They soon got their wish. Over the course of a century, the spinning jenny, the water frame and the power loom, and a host of other inventions, exponentially increased the rates of production. Think of the Industrial Revolution, and coal and steel will spring to mind. But it would be more accurate were we to picture instead the busy whir of threaded looms and cavernous factories choked with cotton dust. Indeed, even so fundamental an economic principle as division of labour had as a model the making of textiles. Nearly a century before Adam Smith conjured his hypothetical pin factory, the economist William Petty wrote that cloth must be cheaper made when one cards, another spins, another weaves, another draws, another dresses, another presses and packs, than when all the operations above mentioned were clumsily performed by the same hand. All this change had profound consequences for spinners and weavers. Take, for example, the plight of woolen cloth workers in Leeds in 1786, who suddenly found their livelihoods threatened by the invention of new scribbling machines, able to card the fibres more quickly and cheaply than they could. How are those men, they asked in a petition to a local newspaper, thus thrown out of employ, to provide for their families, and what are they to put their children apprenticed to, that the rising generation may have something to keep them at work, in order that they may not be like vagabonds strolling about in idleness? It was fears such as these that gave rise to the Luddite movement, a wave of violence against machinery by unemployed cloth workers. The term Luddite has since become derogatory, used to signify a techno-dinosaur vainly standing in the way of progress. Today, when the livelihoods of workers in diverse industries are similarly threatened by the development of new technologies, the lamentations of the Luddites feel all too relatable once more. Spinning tales. That must be wonderful cloth, thought the emperor. If I were to be dressed in a suit made of this cloth, I should be able to find out which men in my empire were unfit for their places, and I could distinguish the clever from the stupid. I must have this cloth woven for me without delay. And he gave a large sum of money to the swindlers in advance. Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor's New Clothes, 1837. The threads spun by the fates were relentless. However much their subjects tried to avoid the futures spun for them, they found that they could not. Oedipus's parents tried desperately to prevent the boy from murdering his father and marrying his mother, as had been foretold, but these events played out nevertheless. Likewise, wishes granted in stories often rebound horribly on the wisher. So it is with the Greek legend of King Midas. In the story, the king is so enamoured of wealth that he prays to the gods to make his mere touch enough to turn any object immediately to gold. His wish is duly granted. Not long thereafter, the king dies of starvation, unable to eat so much as a single grape without it turning to a gold nugget the moment it touches his lips. While this tale is familiar, less well known is the historical King Midas, the likely model for the myth. He ruled Phrygia, an ancient state in what is now Turkey, in the last decades of the 8th century BC. He makes an appearance in Greek historical records, but archaeological traces remain too. The Phrygian capital of Gordion was razed in the early 7th century BC.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?